I've been silent for 40 years. 40 years since I looked into eyes that weren't human but held more humanity than any man I've ever known. I was told to forget what I saw. I was told it was a trick of the mind, a symptom of trauma. But I know the truth. The forest remembers, and so do I. Before we begin, consider subscribing, and let me know in the comments where you're listening from. My name is Walter, and back in 1978 I was a different man. Just 24 years old, with a face that hadn't yet been carved up by time and regret. I was a park ranger in the sprawling national forests of the Pacific Northwest. It was a lonely job, but I liked the quiet. My father was a logger, worked these same woods his whole life until a falling widowmaker took him when I was 16. For me, the forest was a cathedral and a tomb all at once. I felt closer to him out there. He used to tell me, "Some things in the forest don't want to be found, son. You have to respect that." I thought he meant hidden springs or old hunting grounds. I was wrong. My life was a simple loop of routines: checking trail cameras, clearing fallen trees, sleeping in my small ranger station that always smelled of damp pine and cheap coffee. It was a peaceful existence, predictable. Until the call came in on a cold October morning. A little girl was missing. Her name was Sarah, 7 years old, vanished from her family's campsite near Black Creek. 1 minute she was chasing a butterfly. The next, gone. The air turned heavy that day. The normal sounds of the forest, the birds, the squirrels. They all went silent as if holding their breath. I joined the search and rescue team, a mix of state troopers and local volunteers. The sheriff, a stern man named Douglas with a face like a clenched fist, coordinated the effort. We searched for 3 days. We found nothing. No tracks, no torn clothing, not a single sign. The dogs, usually so eager, would get to a certain point near the creek and just stop. They'd whine, tuck their tails, and refuse to go any further. On the 3rd day, I found something. A single footprint pressed deep into the muddy bank of the creek. It was huge, easily 16 inches long and shaped like a human's, but wider, thicker. I called Sheriff Douglas over. He took one look, kicked dirt over it, and said, "Bear track, distorted by the water." I knew what a bear track looked like. This wasn't it. Later that afternoon, another volunteer found one of Sarah's little red hair ribbons. It was tied neatly to a pine branch, a good 15 feet off the ground. No person could have reached that high without a ladder, and there was no way the wind could have done it. Douglas took the ribbon, put it in an evidence bag, and said nothing. The official explanation was becoming clear: a drifter, an abduction. It felt wrong. My gut screamed that the answer was still in the woods. That night, they called off the official search. Sarah was gone. I couldn't sleep. The image of that little girl's smiling face from the flyer was burned into my mind, and my father's words echoed in my head. Some things in the forest don't want to be found. Was he talking about a place or a person or something else entirely? I couldn't live with myself if I didn't try one more time. Against regulations, against common sense, I packed a bag, grabbed my strongest flashlight, and headed back into the silent woods alone. I walked for hours, guided by nothing but instinct. I felt drawn towards the old basalt cliffs, a remote area the search teams had barely touched because of the dangerous terrain. The air grew colder. A strange smell hit me. Not rot, but something musky and almost sweet, like damp earth and overripe fruit. I felt a familiar sensation, the one you get when you know you're being watched. The hairs on my neck stood up. I kept walking. I found it behind a curtain of icy waterfall, a narrow opening in the rock face, almost completely hidden. A cave. My heart was pounding so loud I was sure anything in a mile radius could hear it. I took a deep breath, switched on my flashlight, and stepped inside. The beam cut through the darkness, and there she was. Sarah. She was curled up on a bed of soft moss and ferns, fast asleep, perfectly safe. She wasn't even cold. And she wasn't alone. Standing over her, a silent guardian, was a creature that my mind refused to process. It was tall, easily 8 feet, covered in long, dark brown hair that was matted with leaves and bits of pine. It was female, I could tell, but it was her face that stopped my breath. It wasn't the face of an ape. It was something more. The features were flat, the brow heavy, but the eyes. Her eyes were deep and dark and ancient. They held an intelligence that was unnerving and a profound, heartbreaking sadness. I froze, my flashlight beam trembling on her. She didn't move, didn't make a sound. She just looked at me, not with aggression, but with a kind of weary understanding. Slowly, she raised a massive hand, not in threat, but in a gesture. She pointed at Sarah, then pointed towards the mouth of the cave. The message was unmistakable. Take her. Leave. I carried Sarah out of that forest, and she woke up in my arms. She just looked at me and said, "The hairy lady gave me berries. She kept me warm." When we got back to town, it was chaos. Sheriff Douglas pulled me into his office. I tried to tell him the truth. I told him everything. He listened without interrupting, his face unreadable. When I finished, he leaned across his desk and told me, in a low, cold voice, that I found Sarah alone in a cave, suffering from exposure. He said I was a hero, and he said if I ever mentioned a hairy lady again, he'd have me committed. My career, my reputation, my freedom. It was all on the line. I quit my job a week later. I couldn't look at those trees the same way again. I had seen something ancient, something that wasn't meant for our world, and I had broken a sacred trust. By finding her, I had exposed her. My father's words finally made sense. Some things don't want to be found because they are too old, too fragile for our world. I had respected her wish by staying silent, but I've always carried the guilt of that encounter. I saved a child, but I may have condemned a miracle. Some things in those woods were never meant for us, but they're still out there, waiting. If this story moved you, consider subscribing. Stay safe out there. For the first few years I tried to run from the trees. I moved to the city, found a job in a warehouse where the only sounds were the beep of forklifts and the screech of packing tape. I thought the concrete and the noise would build a wall around that memory, but the forest has roots that run deeper than any city foundation. I'd be stocking shelves under fluorescent lights and suddenly smell damp pine. I'd wake up in my small apartment, slick with sweat. The image of her sad, ancient eyes burned behind my own. I never felt safe. I always felt watched. I tried to live a normal life. I even got married for a while to a kind woman named Martha. She knew something was broken in me, a part of my past that was walled off, but she never pushed. How could I tell her? How could I explain that the reason I sometimes stared out the window at the thin line of trees in the distant park wasn't because I was lost in thought, but because I was looking for a shadow that didn't belong? The silence was a poison. I drank every day. It corroded everything. Martha left after 5 years. She said she couldn't live with a ghost. She was right. My father used to say, "Some secrets aren't yours to keep, they're yours to carry." I carried mine like a stone in my gut. It was a promise I made to Sheriff Douglas, yes, but it felt like a promise I made to her, that creature in the cave. She had trusted me. She had shown me something sacred, and I had brought the world crashing in. My silence was my penance. I owed it to her to keep her safe, to let her remain one of those things that didn't want to be found. I convinced myself that my silence was a shield protecting her. But over time, I started to wonder if it was just a cage I'd built for myself. 40 years is a long time to carry anything. Sheriff Douglas died of a heart attack a decade ago. I read about it in the paper. I felt a strange mix of relief and dread. He was the only other person who knew the real story, the only one who could have corroborated my lie or my truth. With him gone, I was truly alone with it. Sarah, the little girl I carried out of the woods, would be a grown woman now, with a life of her own. I sometimes wondered if she remembered. Did she ever tell anyone about the hairy lady who gave her berries? Or did her parents and the doctors convince her it was just a fever dream, a child's fantasy cooked up by trauma and exposure? I hoped they had. It was safer for everyone that way. I live in a small house now, at the edge of a forgotten suburb. It's quiet. I have a small garden, but I made sure my back fence doesn't face any woods. I can't handle it. I spend my days reading, listening to the radio, letting the world go by. The stone in my gut never went away, but it got smoother over the years, less jagged. I had made a sort of peace with my ghosts. Or so I thought. Then, 3 days ago, the past came knocking, literally. It was a rainy Tuesday afternoon, the sky the color of old bruises. I was making tea when I heard a car pull up, then footsteps on my porch. I don't get visitors. Ever. I looked through the peephole and saw a young man standing there, maybe 25, with a nervous energy about him. He was soaked from the rain, holding a worn, leather-bound journal against his chest to protect it. I didn't recognize him. I opened the door a crack. "Can I help you?" I asked, my voice rusty from disuse. He looked relieved, as if he'd expected to be turned away. "Mr. Walter? Mr. Walter Evans?" I just nodded. "My name is Aaron," he said, pushing a damp strand of hair from his eyes. "My grandfather was Sheriff Douglas. I found his old journals. He wrote about you. He wrote about the disappearance of Sarah in 1978. My blood ran cold. I felt the floor shift beneath my feet. The stone in my gut was suddenly heavy and sharp again. I tried to slam the door, but he was quick. He put his hand out, not aggressively, but just enough to stop it. "Please," he said, his voice earnest. "I'm not a reporter. There are things in here that don't make sense. He wrote that you were a hero. But then, on the last page, written years later, he wrote something else. He wrote, 'Walter saw the truth, and I made him bury it.'" Aaron looked at me, his eyes searching mine for an answer I had sworn to never give. He opened the journal to a bookmarked page. Even from the doorway, I could see Douglas's familiar, cramped handwriting, and I knew my 40 years of silence were about to be broken. I stood there for a long moment, my hand on the cold brass doorknob, the other clutching my half-made cup of tea. The world had shrunk to the space between me and this young man, Aaron, the grandson of the ghost, who had dictated the last 40 years of my life. The rain dripped from the eaves, a steady rhythmic ticking like a clock counting down the seconds of my silence. He was right. I couldn't live with a ghost. But now a new one was standing on my porch, holding the old one's bones in a leather-bound book. With a sigh that felt like it came from the soles of my feet, I stepped back and opened the door wider. "Come in," I said, the words feeling foreign in my mouth. "Don't drip on the rug." He gave a small, grateful nod and stepped inside, bringing the smell of rain and wet earth with him. My small house suddenly felt crowded, invaded. I watched as he carefully placed the journal on my little coffee table, treating it like a holy relic. The leather was dark and cracked with age, the corners softened from years of handling. I could almost feel the weight of it from across the room. "He never talked about it," Aaron said, his voice quiet, respectful. "Not to my dad, not to my grandma. I found this journal in a locked box in his attic after he passed. It's full of case notes, fishing logs, normal stuff. But the last 20 pages are just about Sarah, about you." I didn't say anything. I just went to the kitchen and finished making my tea, my hands shaking so badly that the hot water sloshed over the rim of the mug. I made one for him, too. It was something to do, a way to delay the inevitable. When I came back, he had the journal open. The pages were yellowed, covered in that tight, almost angry script I remembered from the reports I'd had to sign. "At first, it's all official," Aaron explained, tracing a line of text with his finger. "He writes about the search grid, the volunteer logs, the press conferences. He calls you Ranger Evans. And he describes finding Sarah based on your hunch. He praises your instincts as a woodsman." Aaron looked up at me. "He made you sound like a local legend." I gave a bitter little laugh. "He made me sound like a liar he could control." Aaron's gaze fell back to the journal. "I think he knew that." Further in, the tone changes. These aren't case notes anymore. They're confessions. He cleared his throat and began to read. October 29th, 1978. Evans came into my office today. He was pale, shaking. Told me a story about a creature, a female. Said it gave him the child, his eyes. He wasn't lying. A man can't fake that kind of terror. It's the kind of fear that rewrites your soul. I sank into my armchair, the tea forgotten on the end table. Hearing Douglas's words, his private admission, was like a physical blow. For 40 years I had carried the shame of that meeting, the humiliation of being called a fool, a potential madman. I had accepted my role as the traumatized hero with a wild imagination. But he knew. The whole time he knew I was telling the truth. There's more, Aaron said gently. He flipped a few pages. November 5th had the lab discreetly analyze the material from the fern bedding Evans mentioned. Results came back. Hair samples. Non-human primate. Unidentifiable. Larger DNA markers than any known ape. Biologists said it was impossible. Told him it was a contaminated sample. He didn't argue. I burned the report. My breath caught in my chest. Physical evidence. Proof. Douglas had held physical proof in his hands and destroyed it. The shield I thought I was providing for her, my silence. It wasn't a shield. It was just the lock on a cage Douglas had built for the truth. I had been a willing warden for my own prison. Why? I whispered. The question aimed at the ghost of the man in the journal. Why would he do it? Aaron looked at me, his expression a mixture of pity and confusion. I think he was scared. Not just of the creature. He was scared of what it would bring. The media, the scientists, the hunters. He writes here. He scanned the page. This forest has its own laws. Bringing our world in here, it would be like setting a fire in a library. Some things are too old to survive the light. It was a twisted echo of my own father's words, a sentiment I had clung to for decades to justify my silence. And here was Douglas, the man of law and order, admitting the same thing. We were two sides of the same coin, both convinced we were doing the right thing by burying a miracle. I felt a wave of dizziness. The room seemed to tilt, the past and present swirling together. The smell of wet pine from Aaron's coat, the scent of old paper and ink, the memory of damp earth and overripe fruit in that cave. It was all happening again. The last entry is the one I told you about, Aaron said, his voice pulling me back. He turned to the final written page. The handwriting was different, shakier, dated only 5 years before his death. Walter Evans, I wonder where he is. I see his face in my sleep sometimes. He saw the truth, and I made him bury it. God forgive me, I hope he buried it deep enough. A tear I didn't know was there rolled down my cheek. It wasn't a tear of sadness. It was anger. 40 years of my life, twisted out of shape by one man's fear. 40 years of looking over my shoulder, of feeling like a ghost in my own skin. He did more than make me bury it, I said, my voice low and hard. He buried me with it. Aaron closed the journal slowly. I think there's a reason he kept this, he said. I don't think he wanted it to stay buried forever. He looked at me, a question in his eyes, but before he could ask it, he paused, looking back down at the book in his lap. There's one more thing, he said, frowning. A name scribbled in the margin of the last page. It just says one word. Christopher. He looked up at me. Do you know a Christopher? The name hit me like a physical shock. Christopher. Not a name I had heard in 40 years. He wasn't a ranger or a cop. He was an old biologist, a recluse who lived on the far side of the mountain. A man everyone thought was crazy because he spent his life chasing what he called the old ones of the forest. The man I'd been told to avoid at all costs. And the last man to go missing in those woods, 6 months before Sarah ever did. The name Christopher landed in the quiet room like a stone thrown through a window. For a moment I couldn't breathe. It wasn't just a name. It was a key. One that unlocked a door in my mind I had sealed shut with 40 years of hardened regret. I saw a face, not clearly at first, but in flashes. Wild gray hair, eyes that burned with a feverish intensity, and hands stained with dirt and pine sap. Christopher. I said the name aloud, tasting it for the first time in decades. It felt like ash in my mouth. The biologist, they called him Crazy Chris, said he was obsessed. Aaron leaned forward, his face taut with anticipation. Obsessed with what? With them, I said, my voice barely a whisper. He never called them Bigfoot. That was too simple, too much of a circus name for him. He called them the elders or the first people. He believed they were a remnant species, intelligent, shy, and watching us. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the gray, rain-slicked street. My reflection was a ghost in the glass, an old man with haunted eyes. But in my mind, I was 24 again, standing outside Christopher's ramshackle cabin on the north side of the mountain. It was a few months before Sarah went missing. I was on patrol and had seen smoke coming from his chimney, so I stopped by to make sure everything was all right. The place was a chaotic library of the woods. Maps covered every wall, marked with strange symbols. Shelves overflowed with books on primatology, anthropology, and Native American folklore. Plaster casts of huge, unidentifiable footprints were stacked in a corner like firewood. He had been excited to see me, a rare visitor who wasn't there to mock him. He'd grabbed my arm, his grip surprisingly strong, and pulled me over to a large map. "They're moving, Ranger," he'd said, his voice crackling with urgency. "Their patterns are changing. Something spooked them. They're retreating deeper towards the basalt cliffs." He tapped the exact spot where, months later, I would find the cave. "I'm close, Walter, I can feel it. They're not just animals, they have a language, a culture. They mourn their dead. I've seen them do it." I remember nodding politely, thinking he was a harmless eccentric. I told him to be careful. Sheriff Douglas had warned me about him, said he was unstable and to keep my distance. "Some things in the forest don't want to be found," I had told him, parroting my father's words. Christopher had just smiled, a sad, knowing smile. "Oh, I know," he'd said. "But some things need to be understood, or they'll disappear forever." That was the last time I ever saw him. 2 weeks later, his cabin was found empty. No note, no sign of a struggle. His truck was still there. Douglas led a half-hearted search for a couple of days and then declared him another victim of the wilderness, a man who wandered off and got lost. The official report said he likely fell into a ravine or was taken by a mountain lion. Case closed. I turned back from the window, the memory settling like a shroud around me. "He was looking for her," I said to Aaron. "He knew where they were. He must have gotten too close." Aaron was staring at the journal, his knuckles white. "Oh, God," he whispered. He pointed to a passage I couldn't see. "He writes about Christopher, my grandfather. He says, found Christopher's research notes in the cabin, filled with nonsense about giants. Confiscated them as evidence. They were lost in a file room flood the next year. There was no flood, Walter. I checked the station's records. There was never any flood. The pieces were falling into place, forming a picture more terrible than I had imagined. Douglas hadn't just covered up Sarah's rescue. His cover-up had started months earlier, with Christopher's disappearance. When I came out of those woods with Sarah and my impossible story, Douglas didn't just see a ranger suffering from trauma. He saw the second loose end in a story he desperately wanted to bury. He couldn't have two impossible events happening in the same remote area, both pointing to the same unbelievable truth. So he erased Christopher and he silenced me. "He knew," I said, the anger I'd felt earlier returning, colder and sharper this time. "He knew Christopher hadn't just wandered off. He found his notes. He might have even found something else, and he buried it all." My silence hadn't been a shield for her. It had been the final shovelful of dirt on Christopher's grave. I had helped a man get away with erasing another man's life, and I never even knew it. The weight of that realization was crushing, a physical pressure in my chest. For 40 years I had carried the guilt of one secret, only to find it was wrapped around another, much darker one. "What do we do?" Aaron asked, his voice shaking slightly. He was just a kid, caught in the undertow of a story that started long before he was born. He had come here looking for answers about his grandfather, and had found a monster. I looked at the journal, at the cracked leather that held 40 years of lies. Then I looked at Aaron, at his young, determined face. For the first time in a very long time, I didn't feel like a ghost. I felt like a man with a debt to pay. "Your grandfather was wrong," I said, my voice steady now, filled with a purpose I hadn't felt since I was a young man pulling on my ranger's uniform. He said I should have buried the truth deep enough. But some things don't stay buried. Some things have roots. I walked over to my coat closet and pulled out a dusty rucksack and a pair of old, worn hiking boots. "We're going to go digging." The air in my small living room was suddenly thick with 40 years of unspoken words. Aaron looked from my old rucksack to my face, his expression a mixture of fear and awe. He was seeing the ghost of the man I used to be, the ranger who walked out of those woods and never truly came back. "Digging where?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "The basalt cliffs. Based on my grandfather's map, that's a 3-day hike minimum. And that was in 1978. The trails are gone, Walter. That whole area is designated wilderness now. No maintenance, no patrols." I pulled the boots from the closet. The leather was stiff, cracked like old earth, but the soles were still good. I ran my thumb over the worn laces, the muscle memory of tying them in the pre-dawn chill of the ranger station still sharp in my hands. "I know the way," I said. "The forest changes, but the bones of it don't. The rivers, the ridges, they're still there. I can find it." I dropped the boots on the floor with a heavy thud. The sound seemed to wake something in the room, a sense of purpose. I started pulling other things from the closet. An old canvas pack that smelled of pine needles and damp earth, a tarnished brass compass, a heavy wool blanket. Each item was a relic from a life I had locked away. Aaron watched me, his own energy shifting from shock to resolve. "Okay," he said, pulling out his phone. "I've got GPS, satellite imagery, a portable charger. I can download topographic maps of the area. We'll have a digital backup." I paused, holding the compass in my palm. It felt cool and solid, reliable. It didn't need batteries, it just needed you to know which way was north. "Bring it," I said, "but don't trust it. Up there, the canyons play tricks on signals. Sometimes the only thing you can trust is what's right in front of your face. And your feet." We spent the next hour preparing in near silence. It was a strange partnership. Me, with my analog world of waxed canvas and honed steel. Him, with his glowing screens and lithium batteries. I packed dried rations, a water filter, a small hatchet, and the hunting knife my father had given me. It was the same knife I'd had on my belt the day I found Sarah. I laid it on the table, its edge still keen. Aaron packed protein bars, electrolyte packets, and a first aid kit that looked like it could handle a field surgery. "What are we looking for exactly?" he asked as he zipped a side pocket on his modern, lightweight pack. His body? The question hung in the air. Christopher's body. I'd never allowed myself to think about it in such concrete terms. He had just vanished. A story the forest told itself. But Douglas hadn't seen it that way. He'd seen a problem to be sanitized. "I don't know," I answered honestly, my voice rough. "We're looking for what Douglas buried. Maybe it's your grandfather's research. Maybe it's a place, maybe it's just the truth. Christopher said they were mourning their dead. If something happened to him up there, near their home." I didn't finish the thought. I didn't have to. If they saw him as one of their own, or as a threat that had been neutralized, they might have done something. Treated him according to their own customs. A thought struck me then, cold and clear. "Douglas's journal," I said, turning to Aaron. "Did he write anything else? Any other entries about that area after Christopher disappeared?" Aaron shook his head. "No. That's the strange part. After that entry about the lost notes, there's nothing. No mention of the basalt cliffs, no follow-ups on the missing person case. It's like the whole subject was erased from his memory, too. Of course. A clean break, a professional cover-up. Douglas was thorough. He closed the file and threw away the key, He just didn't count on his own grandson digging it up 40 years later. I looked at the map on the table, the one Christopher had marked. The basalt cliffs. A place so remote, so difficult to reach, that it was the perfect place to hide, or to be hidden. I remembered my father's words again, how they echoed in my mind not as a warning but as a fact. Some things in the forest don't want to be found, and some things need to be. I whispered to myself. We finished packing. My old rucksack was heavy on my shoulders, a familiar weight I hadn't felt in decades. It felt right. I looked over at Aaron, who was adjusting the straps on his own pack. He wasn't a ranger or a survivalist. He was a history student from the city. But I saw the same look in his eyes that I'd seen in his grandfather's, a stubborn, unyielding need to understand. We leave at first light, I said. Get some sleep if you can. He just nodded, his eyes fixed on the map. I knew neither of us would sleep that night. The forest was waiting. It had kept its secrets for 40 years. But now, we were coming to ask for them back. And I had a feeling it wasn't going to give them up easily. We weren't just heading into the wilderness. We were heading into a memory, into a grave that Douglas had dug for two men, Christopher and the young ranger I once was. And I was determined that this time at least one of us was going to climb out. The morning broke cold and sharp, the kind of cold that feels like a clean slate. Steam plumed from my mouth with every breath, a ghost of the life still in me. Aaron was already up, moving with the quiet efficiency of someone who had spent the night staring at a map instead of sleeping. He had a thermos of coffee and he handed me a cup without a word. The gesture felt older than he was, a small moment of camaraderie before we stepped into the unknown. My own pack, a canvas and leather relic from another lifetime, sat by the door. It was heavy with 40 years of silence. We didn't talk much as we drove my old truck to the trailhead. The gravel road rattled the frame, a familiar song of the deep woods. I watched the trees pass by, fir and cedar standing like silent sentinels. They were the same trees that had watched me grow up, the same ones that had watched my father work, the same ones that had swallowed Christopher whole. At the trailhead, I pulled the emergency brake. The engine ticked as it cooled, the only sound in the vast stillness. This is it, I said, my voice feeling small against the backdrop of the mountains. The path isn't maintained anymore. From here on, we're on our own. Aaron just nodded, his jaw set. He shouldered his pack, the modern nylon and aluminum frame a stark contrast to my worn leather straps. He was ready, maybe more ready than I was. For him, this was a search for a ghost. For me, it was a confrontation with one. The first few hours were just hard work. The trail was overgrown, a faint suggestion of a path that the forest was slowly digesting. We climbed steadily, the air thinning, our breaths coming in rhythmic pants. I could feel the burn in my legs, a dull ache that reminded me I wasn't 24 anymore. Aaron, for his part, moved with an easy strength, but he stayed close, letting me set the pace. He knew I wasn't just navigating a trail. I was navigating a memory. It was around midday when I first felt it. It wasn't a sound or a sight, it was a subtraction. The constant, low-level chatter of the forest, the squirrels scolding from branches, the jays screeching their alarms, the rustle of small things in the undergrowth. It all just stopped. One moment it was there. The next, it was gone. We had walked into a pocket of absolute silence. It's peaceful up here, Aaron said, his voice hushed as if respecting a library. I stopped and held up a hand. I shook my head slowly. No, I whispered. This isn't peace. This is quiet. There's a difference. He looked at me, confused. What do you mean? Peace is when the woods are alive and nothing is afraid, I explained, my eyes scanning the canopy. This is when everything is holding its breath. Everything is hiding. Something big is nearby, and nothing wants to be its lunch. A flicker of understanding and then fear crossed Aaron's face. He started looking around. not at the beauty of the old-growth trees, but into the deep shadows between them. He was finally starting to see the forest not as a park, but as a kingdom, with rules we didn't understand. I remembered this exact feeling from 40 years ago. The day Christopher went missing, I was on a patrol 2 ridges over, and the same heavy blanket of silence had descended. I'd noted it in my log. When I mentioned it to Douglas during the initial search, he'd waved it off. Animals are unpredictable, Walter. It means nothing. But it meant everything. It was the first warning bell, the one we all ignored. My father's voice echoed in my head, as clear as if he were standing beside me. Some things in the forest don't want to be found, son. He didn't just mean places. He meant things that could impose their will on the world around them, that could command silence just by passing through. We kept walking, but the mood had shifted. The hike was no longer just a physical challenge. It was a slow, creeping intrusion into a place that felt occupied. Every snapped twig under my boots sounded like a gunshot in the stillness. Aaron kept looking over his shoulder. He was starting to feel it too, the weight of unseen eyes. An hour later, I found it. Half buried in moss and dirt at the base of a giant cedar was a small, rusted metal plate, a geological survey marker from the 70s. I knelt down, my knee popping in protest, and brushed the debris away. The stamped numbers were barely legible. I pulled out my own folded, yellowed map from an inside pocket of my jacket. Not a copy, but my original from 1978. I ran my finger along a faint pencil line I had drawn decades ago. "This is it," I said, my heart hammering against my ribs. This was Christopher's baseline. He used this marker as his starting point for mapping the basalt cliffs. Aaron knelt beside me, his expression a mixture of awe and sorrow. He reached out and touched the cold metal, a tangible link to the grandfather he'd never known. So, he was here. He was right here. He was, I confirmed, and his notes said the most unusual readings were 2 miles north of this point, straight up that ridge. I pointed towards a steep, unforgiving incline, thick with ancient trees and dark shadows. There was no trail there at all. It was a solid wall of wilderness. But as we stood there in that profound, unnatural silence, I smelled something on the air. It was faint, carried on a breeze that was suddenly colder than it should have been. A strange, musky scent, like damp earth and wet fur and something else. Something I couldn't name. It was the smell of the forest's oldest secret. I got to my feet, my body aching but my resolve like iron. "Let's go," I said. "We're getting close." We weren't just following a map anymore, we were following a ghost. And I knew with a certainty that chilled me to the bone that something was waiting for us up there. It had waited for 40 years, and it knew we were coming. The climb was brutal. There was no trail, just a near vertical wall of earth, roots, and rock. I used my hands, grabbing onto thick knots of cedar roots and pulling myself up, my old muscles screaming in protest. Every few feet I'd stop and look back down at Aaron. He was younger, stronger, but he wasn't used to this. His breathing was ragged, his face pale with exertion and something else, a primal fear he was trying to hide. The city had made him soft, but the forest was hardening him by the second. The silence was a living thing around us. It pressed in on my ears, a dull, humming void where the sounds of birds and insects should have been. The only noises were our own harsh breaths and the scrape of our boots on stone. That strange, musky scent was getting stronger with every foot of elevation we gained. It was a thick, animal smell, but clean, not like rot. It smelled of power. "How much farther?" Aaron gasped, leaning against the trunk of a massive fir tree, his chest heaving. I didn't look at my map. I didn't need to. I could feel it. "We're in his territory now," I said, my voice a low hush. "Don't talk unless you have to, and keep your eyes open." He nodded, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of a trembling hand. He was learning. He was finally understanding that this wasn't just a search for answers. It was a pilgrimage into a place that didn't belong to men. We climbed for another 20 minutes before I saw the first sign. High above my head, maybe 12 feet off the ground, a thick branch on a Douglas fir had been snapped clean in two. The break was fresh, the wood inside a pale white against the dark bark. It wasn't bent or torn by wind. It was broken, shattered by an immense force. I stopped and pointed. "No bear did that," I whispered. Aaron followed my gaze, his eyes widening. "A bear would have claw marks all over the trunk if it climbed that high. There's nothing. It was just snapped." "What could do that?" he asked, his voice barely audible. I didn't answer. I just remembered Douglas, 40 years ago, standing over a set of huge, unidentifiable tracks in the mud. "Probably a bear with worn-down pads, Walter," he'd said, his voice full of condescending certainty. "You're letting your imagination run wild again." He had an explanation for everything, a neat little box to put the impossible in so he could ignore it. But the forest doesn't fit in a box. We kept moving. The ground began to level out slightly as we neared the top of the ridge. The trees here were even older, their canopies so thick that the forest floor was cast in a permanent twilight. And then we saw the second sign. In a small, unnaturally clear patch of ground, 3 large, flat river stones were stacked one on top of the other. It wasn't a random geological formation. The balance was too perfect, too deliberate. It was a marker, an altar, something made by a mind. Aaron stopped dead in his tracks. "What is that?" he whispered. "I don't know." I lied. I knew exactly what it was. It was a message. It was a signpost that read, "You are not welcome here." My heart was a drum against my ribs. This was what Christopher must have seen. This was the point where he should have turned back. I walked closer, my boots sinking into the soft, mossy earth. Beside the stone stack, something glinted in the dim light. I knelt down, my joints aching, and picked it up. It was a pair of glasses. One of the lenses was cracked and the metal frame was bent and tarnished, but I recognized them instantly. They were Christopher's. I had seen him wearing them in the photo on the missing person poster, the one that hung in the ranger station for years. I held them in my palm. They were cold, a relic of a man who had stood on this exact spot 4 decades ago and seen what we were seeing. He hadn't turned back. His curiosity, the scientist in him, had pushed him forward. It had been a fatal mistake. "Are those—" Aaron started, his voice cracking. "They're his," I said, my throat tight. I gently placed them back on the ground next to the stones. They belonged here now. Part of the story, part of the warning. The musky smell was overpowering now, clinging to the damp air. It was coming from just ahead, beyond a thick curtain of ancient ferns. I could feel unseen eyes on us, a heavy, patient gaze that seemed to penetrate my very soul. This was it, the end of the map, the end of the trail. I took a deep breath, the cold air burning my lungs. I looked at Aaron. The fear was plain on his face, but there was something else there too. Resolve. He had his grandfather's stubborn curiosity. He wouldn't turn back either. "Stay behind me," I said, my hand resting on the handle of the large hunting knife on my belt. It was a useless gesture, a talisman against a god, but it was all I had. Slowly, I pushed aside the tall, wet ferns. Beyond them was a small clearing, dominated by a sheer wall of dark basalt rock, the cliffs from Christopher's notes. At the base of the cliff was a dark opening, a cave. The entrance was huge, far bigger than any bear den, and from the blackness within, I heard a sound that froze the blood in my veins. It was a soft, low sound, a deep, guttural sigh. It wasn't the sound of an animal in pain or anger. It sounded like sorrow, a lonely, ancient grief that had echoed in these woods for centuries. And it knew we were there. The sound hung in the air between us, thick and heavy like the fog. It wasn't a growl, not a roar. It was the sound of a lung emptying, a breath drawn from a chest as wide as a barrel. Aaron flinched beside me, a sharp intake of his own breath, but I remained perfectly still. I couldn't move. My feet were rooted to the forest floor, anchors of memory dragging me down into the cold, dark earth of 1978. I knew that sound. I had carried it in the hollows of my ears for 40 years. It was the soundtrack to every sleepless night, every time I looked in the mirror and saw a coward staring back. It was the sound of a loneliness so profound, it had become a physical presence in these woods. Walter, what was that? Aaron's voice was a bare whisper, stolen by the oppressive silence that followed the sigh. I didn't answer him. I couldn't. My throat was a knot of unspoken warnings. My father's voice echoed in my head, as clear as if he were standing right there with us, his hand on my shoulder. Some things in the forest don't want to be found, son. You have to respect that. I'd failed to respect it once. It cost Christopher his life and me my soul. And now here I was, a fool leading another lamb to the same altar. The musky scent was a wall we couldn't pass through. It was of damp earth, rotting pine needles, and something else. Something warm and alive. It was the smell of a massive living creature, an animal that had never known a cage. I slowly raised my hand, a silent command for Aaron to stay put. He was trembling, but he obeyed. His eyes were locked on the black maw of the cave, wide with a terrifying mixture of fear and awe. My own heart was a frantic bird beating against my ribs, desperate to escape. Every instinct I had honed over a lifetime in these woods was screaming at me. Not danger, not predator, but something far more complex. It was screaming trespasser. We were standing on holy ground, uninvited. I took one slow, deliberate step forward. The moss and soil muffled the sound, but in the crushing silence it felt like a gunshot. From within the cave, something shifted. A scrape of stone on stone, a rustle of dry leaves deep inside. It was aware of my movement. It was watching. It was waiting. We need to go, I finally managed to say, my voice a dry rasp. Now, Aaron, we leave the glasses. We leave everything. We just turn around and walk away. No, he said, his voice surprisingly firm. My grandfather didn't turn away. I'm not going to either. Your grandfather made a mistake, I hissed, turning to him, my face a mask of desperation. He didn't understand what he was looking at. He saw science. He should have seen a god. But his eyes weren't on me anymore. They were fixed on the entrance. Something was happening. A shape was detaching itself from the deeper shadows within the cave. It was slow, impossibly slow. It wasn't the lurching movement of a bear or the slink of a cougar. It was a heavy, bipedal motion, the ponderous, deliberate movement of something immense carrying its own weight. The air grew colder. A shadow fell over the entrance, a silhouette that blocked out what little light penetrated the canopy. It was huge, taller than any man, broader than any bear I'd ever seen. Its shoulders were massive, sloping down to long, powerful arms that hung almost to its knees. The shape of the head was not ape-like. It was domed, heavy, more human in its proportions. And then it stepped into the gray twilight of the clearing. It wasn't a monster. It wasn't a beast. It was a being. Its body was covered in long matted hair, the color of dark soil and old bark, streaked with gray around its powerful chest and shoulders. Its face was the most shocking part. The skin was leathery, dark and deeply lined like ancient wood. The jaw was powerful, but the features weren't savage. They were weathered, tired. But the eyes, dear God, the eyes. They weren't the glowing red orbs of campfire stories. They were deep-set, brown, and filled with an intelligence that struck me dumb. They were ancient, filled with a sorrow that mirrored the sound we had heard. They looked at us, not with aggression, but with a weary, profound sadness. It looked at Aaron, then its gaze shifted and settled on me. And in that moment, I swear it knew me. It remembered me. It saw the terrified 24-year-old boy I had been, and it saw the broken old man I had become. Its gaze held no malice. It held recognition, and a deep, bottomless well of grief. It took another step forward, and the ground seemed to tremble slightly. It raised one of its massive hands, not in a threat, but slowly, with the palm turned slightly upward, It was a gesture, a question, a plea. Aaron let out a choked gasp beside me. He was frozen solid, his face pale, his camera forgotten at his side. Time itself seemed to have stopped. The wind died. The birds were silent. There was only the creature, us, and 40 years of silence hanging between us. The creature's eyes never left mine. It opened its mouth, and it wasn't a roar that came out. It was a series of soft guttural clicks and a low, mournful hum. It was language. It was communication. It was trying to tell me something. And as I stared into those impossibly human eyes, I realized with a cold, terrifying certainty that it was the same thing it had tried to tell me all those years ago. And this time I had to understand. My life, and Aaron's, depended on it. My mind was a battlefield. The 24-year-old ranger inside me was screaming, a raw, primal command to turn and run, to not look back, to leave this impossible thing to the shadows where it belonged. That younger man had won 40 years ago. He had fled, leaving a question unanswered in the deep woods, a question that had echoed in the silence of my life ever since. But the old man, the one standing there now with aching joints and a heart heavy with 4 decades of what-ifs, he refused to move. He had run once. He would not run again. The creature's deep brown eyes held me, and in them I saw a reflection of my own conflict. It saw the fear, but it also saw the regret. Its gaze was a mirror to my own soul. It took another ponderous step, and the scent of pine needles and damp earth was suddenly mixed with something else, something metallic and wrong, the smell of old blood and infection. It lowered its massive head slightly, and the mournful hum changed in pitch. It became a low, guttural sound of pain. It slowly, deliberately, turned its body, angling its left side toward me. Its long, powerful arm, the one that could have snapped me in two, lifted away from its torso. And I saw it. Lodged deep in the muscle and matted fur below its ribs was a piece of rusted metal. It looked like a section of a large industrial bear trap, the kind that had been outlawed for decades. The teeth had been ripped from the mechanism, but a jagged 3-foot-long piece of steel was still buried in its side. The fur around it was caked and dark. The skin was swollen and angry. The wound was old, infected, festering. My breath hitched in my throat. This creature wasn't here to threaten us. It wasn't a monster emerging to claim its territory. It was dying, and it was asking for help. The clicks and guttural sounds it made were not a language of warning, but a language of suffering. It was telling me its story, the story of the trap, of the pain, of the slow decay. It was showing me the source of the sorrow in its eyes. It had been carrying this wound, this piece of my world inside it for how long? Weeks? Months? My father's words came back to me then not as a warning but as a condemnation. Some things in the forest don't want to be found. We hadn't respected that. Someone had come here into its home and laid a trap. A brutal, ignorant piece of steel. We were the monsters. We had always been the monsters. I looked from the horrific wound back to its face. Its expression was unchanged, but the context was entirely different. The weariness was pain. The sadness was a plea. It had remembered me. The boy who ran. Maybe it thought the boy who ran away was the only human it could risk showing itself to again. Maybe it thought, after 40 years, that boy had grown into a man who might understand. All the fear in my body evaporated, replaced by a profound and overwhelming sense of shame. I had spent a lifetime haunted by what I thought was a monster, when the real monstrosity was the steel trap and the person who set it. I took a slow, deliberate step forward. Beside me, I heard Aaron make a tiny, terrified noise, like a whimpering animal. "Stay," I said, my voice low and hoarse, not looking at him. "Don't move." I raised my hand slowly, palms open, the way you would with a frightened horse. "I see," I whispered, the words feeling small and useless in the vast silence. "I see it. I understand." The creature watched my every move. Its breathing was labored, a heavy, wet sound that spoke of the infection raging inside its powerful body. It didn't flinch as I took another step and then another. I was 10 feet away now. I could smell the sickness on it, a sweet, rotten odor that turned my stomach. I could see the individual gray hairs on its chest, the deep lines around its mouth. It blinked, a slow, heavy motion. A single, thick tear like sap welled in the corner of its eye and traced a path through the grime on its leathery cheek. It knew I understood. The moment of decision was upon me. This was the crossroads my entire life had led to. The choice I failed to make as a young man was now presented to me again, in its most stark and impossible form. I could turn away again, leave it to its fate, and live with the certainty of my own cowardice. Or I could try. I could do something. I stopped, about 6 feet from it, close enough to feel the heat coming off its massive body. I held its gaze, this ancient, suffering king of the forest. I gave it a slow, deliberate nod, a promise. Then, without breaking eye contact, I spoke to the man frozen behind me. My voice was steady, imbued with a purpose I hadn't felt in 40 years. "Aaron," I said, the word cutting through the sacred silence. "In the truck under the passenger seat. There's a green canvas bag. The large first aid kit. Bring it to me. Now." For a moment that stretched into an eternity, Aaron didn't move. His face was a pale mask in the gloom, his eyes wide and fixed on the creature. I could hear his breathing, shallow and fast, the sound of a man whose world had just been torn apart. He looked at me, then back at the creature, a silent, desperate question in his eyes. Was I insane? Was this real? "Now, Aaron," I repeated, my voice leaving no room for argument. It wasn't a request. It was an order born from a 40-year-old debt. He finally broke his paralysis. He gave a jerky nod, his throat working but no sound coming out. He started backing away, one slow shuffling step at a time, his movements clumsy with fear. He never took his eyes off the creature. The movement, however small, was a mistake. The creature's head snapped up. A low growl like stones grinding together deep in the earth rumbled in its chest. Its muscles tensed, the massive shoulders bunching. The pain in its eyes was momentarily replaced by a flash of primal fear, the cornered animal instinct that knows any sudden move could mean death. It thought Aaron was either fleeing to get a weapon or abandoning it to its fate. It didn't know which was worse. "Easy," I said, my voice a soft murmur. I didn't look at the creature. I kept my eyes on Aaron, but my words were for the ancient being in front of me. "He's not going to hurt you. He's helping." I took another half step closer, putting myself more firmly between it and Aaron's retreating form. It was a stupid, instinctive gesture. I was a frail old man against a being of impossible strength, but it was a gesture of intent. I was on its side. The creature's dark eyes shifted from Aaron back to me. The growl subsided, but its body remained coiled like a spring. It was watching me, judging me, trying to read the truth in my posture, in the scent of my sweat. I held my ground, my hands still open and visible. I was an open book, a book of regret and shame, but an open one. I could finally see the trap clearly. It was an old bear trap, a huge saw-toothed monstrosity, illegal for decades. Rust caked its jaws, but the springs were still brutally strong. They had bitten deep into the muscle and sinew of its calf, the metal disappearing into swollen, infected flesh. A dark, foul-smelling liquid oozed from the wound, staining the matted fur. The chain attached to it was thick and heavy, bolted to a metal stake driven deep into the earth. Whoever set this wasn't trying to catch a bear. They were trying to hold a monster. The irony was a physical sickness in my stomach. Behind me, I heard the crunch of Aaron's boots on the gravel path as he finally reached the truck. The sound of the truck door creaking open was unnaturally loud in the silent forest. The creature flinched again, its gaze darting towards the sound. "It's all right," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "It's for you. Help is for you." I dared to take another small step. I was close now, so close I could see the tremor in its wounded leg, the faint, rapid pulse beating in the thick muscle of its neck. It smelled of pine needles, wet earth, and the coppery tang of old blood and infection. It smelled like the forest itself, in life, and in death. It watched me, and in that moment, I felt a strange and profound connection. It was a shared understanding of pain. My pain was old, a thing of memory and spirit. Its pain was new, a thing of steel and flesh. But pain was the bridge between us. The fumbling sounds from the truck stopped. A moment later, I heard Aaron's hesitant footsteps returning. He was moving slower now, more carefully. The creature heard him too. Its ears, small and rounded, twitched. It let out a long, shuddering breath, a sound of pure, bottomless exhaustion. It seemed to understand that the moment of truth was here. It could either lash out with its remaining strength or it could trust. Trust the boy who had run away all those years ago. I held its gaze. I didn't know what it saw in my eyes. Maybe it saw the ghost of that terrified young man. Or maybe after a lifetime of hiding from our world, it finally saw a flicker of something it recognized as its own, a deep and abiding sorrow. Aaron appeared at my side, his movements stiff. He was holding the large green canvas bag like it was a bomb. His hands were shaking so badly I was surprised he hadn't dropped it. He wouldn't look at the creature. He just stared at the bag in his hands, his knuckles white. "Put it down," I said softly, slowly, right here on the ground. He did as I said, carefully placing the first aid kit between us. He then scrambled back a few feet, putting a safer distance between himself and the impossible thing sitting before us. I knelt down, my old knees protesting with a series of cracks and pops. I never broke eye contact with the creature. My movements were slow, deliberate. I unzipped the bag. Inside was a mess of gauze, antiseptic wipes, bottles of iodine and peroxide, suture kits, and heavy-duty bandages. It was the kit I kept for serious injuries. Animal attacks, falls from ridges, chainsaw accidents. I'd never imagined I would use it for this. I pulled out a pair of sterile gloves and a bottle of saline solution. The creature watched my every move. It was completely still, a statue carved from shadow and pain. It had made its choice. It was going to trust me. And as I prepared to touch the wound, to touch this being that had haunted my entire adult life, I knew that my choice was just beginning. Helping it was one thing. But what came after? What in God's name would come after? My hands trembled as I brought the saline-soaked gauze closer. The world seemed to shrink to this single point in time. My hand, the wound, and the ancient intelligent eyes watching me. The air was thick with the smell of blood and pine, a scent that would be burned into my memory forever. I took a breath, the cold air stinging my lungs, and gently touched the torn flesh. The creature didn't flinch. It didn't growl. There was only a slight, almost imperceptible tensing of the massive muscle beneath my fingers. It was a reaction of pain, not aggression. It was bearing it, allowing it. In that moment, I felt the full weight of its trust, a burden heavier than any pack I'd ever carried. "I need the forceps, Aaron," I said, my voice a low rasp. I didn't look back at him. My focus was entirely on the task. In the small side pocket, and a clean cloth. I heard a rustle, then the clink of metal. A shaky hand appeared in my peripheral vision, holding the tool. I took it without looking up. Aaron was breathing in short, sharp gasps, like a man trying not to hyperventilate. He was terrified, but he was still here. That counted for something. I used the cloth to gently clean around the wound, clearing away the matted fur and dried blood. The injury was worse than I'd thought. It wasn't a bullet hole, or the clean slice of a hunter's knife. It was a jagged, ugly tear, deep and inflamed. And buried deep inside, I saw the glint of rusted metal. It looked like a piece of an old steel trap, the kind loggers used to use decades ago to guard their camps from predators, the kind my father might have set. The thought was a cold stone in my gut. "Hold the light steady," I instructed Aaron, who was now holding a small flashlight, its beam dancing nervously across the creature's leg. I positioned the forceps. "This is going to hurt," I whispered, more to myself than to the being in front of me. "I'm sorry," I took a firm grip on the edge of the metal shard and began to pull. The creature's entire body went rigid. A low sound rumbled in its chest, a deep, guttural groan of pure agony that vibrated through the ground. It wasn't a roar. It was the sound of something enduring the unendurable. Its head lifted slightly, its dark eyes locking onto mine, and in their depths, I saw not just pain, but a question, a silent plea. I didn't look away. I held its gaze and pulled harder. My own muscles strained, my knuckles white. The rusted metal scraped against bone and tissue. The creature shuddered, a tremor that shook its whole frame, but it didn't move to stop me. It just watched me, its breath coming in ragged pants. Then, with a final sickening squelch, the metal came free. It was a 4-inch piece of jagged steel, dark with rust and the creature's blood. I dropped it to the ground where it clattered against a stone. The creature let out a long, shuddering sigh, and its body seemed to sag with a mixture of relief and exhaustion. For a moment, I just knelt there, breathing heavily. My father's words echoed in my mind, the ones he'd said to me so many times. Some things in the forest don't want to be found, son. You have to respect that. I had always thought it was a warning to stay away, to leave the mysteries of the woods alone. But as I looked at this magnificent, wounded being, I understood the real meaning. It wasn't about avoidance, it was about reverence. You respect their world by not forcing yours upon it. But what do you do when their world is broken by a piece of yours? What does respect mean then? The iodine, Aaron, I said, my voice shaking slightly. He passed me the bottle, his hand still trembling. I poured the dark liquid liberally into the open wound. This time the creature did flinch, letting out a sharp hiss of pain as the antiseptic burned. But again, it held still. It seemed to understand. It understood medicine. It understood help. I worked for what felt like an hour, though it was probably only 15 minutes. I cleaned the wound thoroughly, packed it with sterile gauze, and wrapped it tightly with wide elastic bandages. My hands, once clumsy with shock, now moved with the familiar confidence of a man who had patched up more than his share of injuries in the wild. But none like this. Never like this. When I was done, I sat back on my heels, my work complete. The leg was bandaged, the bleeding stopped. The immediate danger of infection was lessened. I had done all I could. I looked up at the creature's face. Its eyes were half closed, a sign of deep weariness. It looked at its bandaged leg, then back at me. There was no malice in its gaze, no fear. There was something else, something far more complex. Gratitude, perhaps, but also a profound sadness. It slowly, deliberately, raised its massive, uninjured arm. Its long, dark fingers unfurled. It reached out, not towards me, but towards Aaron, who was still standing a few feet back, frozen in place. The creature didn't make a sound. It just held its hand out, palm up, in a gesture that was so undeniably, shockingly human. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't a plea. It was an offering, an acknowledgement. It was including him in this strange, sacred moment. Then it turned its gaze back to me. It let out a soft, low sound, a single note that hung in the cold air. It wasn't a sound of pain or fear. It was a question that had nothing to do with its injury and everything to do with what came next. The wound was treated, but we were still here, in the heart of its world, and the sun was beginning to set. The real problem had just begun. The question hung in the air between us, a sound more profound than any word. What now? We had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. I knew, and Aaron knew, that our lives had been neatly cleaved into two parts, the time before this moment and everything that would come after. I slowly got to my feet, my knees cracking in protest. I didn't know what to do. Do you say goodbye? Do you back away slowly? My training had prepared me for bears, for cougars, for lost hikers and forest fires. It had not prepared me for this. The creature lowered its arm and watched me. It was as if it was waiting for me to make the first move, to set the rules for our departure. I looked at Aaron, who was pale as a ghost, his eyes wide, He gave a tiny, almost imperceptible shake of his head, a plea for us to just leave. I took a step back, then another. The creature remained still, its dark, intelligent eyes following my every move. There was no aggression, just a deep, weary observation. I felt like a trespasser in a holy place. Then, it did something that broke my heart. It dipped its massive head, a slow, deliberate nod. It was a gesture of acknowledgement, of dismissal, of an ending. With a grace that seemed impossible for its size, it turned. It didn't run. It simply walked. It moved through the dense undergrowth without making a sound, its powerful legs carrying it away. For a moment, I saw its dark form silhouetted against the dying light, and then it was gone. It didn't vanish. It was absorbed by the forest, reclaimed by the shadows that were its home. The woods were suddenly silent again, but it wasn't the peaceful silence from before. It was an empty silence, a void where something ancient had just been. Aaron and I didn't speak for the entire hike back to the truck. The 3 miles felt like 100. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves made us jump. The familiar woods had become a foreign country. We were no longer the masters here, just 2 small men who had glimpsed something far beyond their understanding. Back at the station, under the harsh fluorescent lights, the reality of what we had to do began to sink in. We had to file a report. It was protocol. "What are we going to write, Walter?" Aaron asked, his voice barely a whisper. He was sitting at the small table, staring at a blank incident form. "The truth," I said, though the word felt hollow. "Injured animal encounter." We wrote it up as best we could. We were vague. "Unidentified species," we wrote. "Large, bipedal, severe laceration to the lower leg." We mentioned the piece of metal we'd removed. We didn't mention its eyes or the way it held itself or the gesture it made. We couldn't. There were no words for that on a government form. We filed it and tried to pretend it was just another day. 2 days later, a black sedan with government plates rolled up to the station. A man in a crisp suit stepped out. He wasn't from the Park Service. His name was Richard. He was in his 50s with cold, gray eyes and a face that looked like it had never smiled. He said he was from the Department of the Interior, a special liaison. He questioned us for 6 hours, separately. He had our report in his hand, but he treated it like a piece of fiction. He asked about the light, about how much we'd slept, if we'd been drinking. He suggested we'd seen a grizzly bear up on its hind legs. That trauma had distorted our memory. "A bear doesn't pull a piece of rebar out of its own leg and wait for a bandage, sir," I told him, my voice steady. Richard just looked at me. He didn't argue. He just let the silence hang in the room. "Ranger Walter," he finally said, leaning forward. "Some things are best left undocumented, for the public good, for the preservation of these lands. An unsubstantiated report like this can cause panic, illegal hunting, a media circus. It does more harm than good." He slid a new form across the table. It was a revised incident report. It described a routine encounter with a disoriented black bear, which we scared off. At the bottom were 2 lines for our signatures. "This is the official version of events," Richard said. It wasn't a request. "Your careers will continue. This forest will remain peaceful. No one else needs to be involved." Aaron signed without hesitation. He just wanted it to be over. I held the pen for a long time, the weight of it feeling immense. I thought of my father's words. Some things in the forest don't want to be found. I had found something, and now I was being ordered to help lose it again. I signed the paper. I chose my career. I chose the lie. That was the last day I truly worked as a park ranger. I stayed on for another 5 years, but the magic was gone. The forest was no longer my sanctuary. It was a constant, silent reminder of my betrayal. Aaron transferred to a park in Colorado a month later. We never spoke of that day again. I heard he quit the service entirely a year after that and moved back east. And now, 40 years later, I'm an old man. My hands shake when I hold a coffee cup, and my face is a roadmap of a life lived with a heavy secret. I've never told anyone. Not my wife, not my children. How could I? How could I explain that I met something more human than most people I know? And then I erased it. I finally understand what my father meant. Respecting the things that don't want to be found isn't about ignoring them. It's about protecting them. It's about seeing the truth and having the courage to guard their world from ours. I failed that test. I saw something beautiful and wounded and ancient, and I helped bury it under a mountain of paperwork and fear. I didn't do it to protect the creature. I did it to protect myself. And I've lived with that shame every single day since. Some things in those woods were never meant for us, but they're still out there, waiting. If this story moved you, consider subscribing. Stay safe out there.